It is 1859. The United States is a lot different than what we see today. There is no instant communication, there's no airplanes or delivery trucks. In fact, what roads that did exist were not necessarily the best, especially the ones running west to east. Transport of goods were difficult from the interior because of these issues. But one mode of transportation was both rising and dying in popularity at the time, and that was the canal systems. The brilliance of a canal system was the ability to transport large amounts of products, such as coal, from the interior of the country to the coast. This made it rise. But a new technology was becoming widespread, the iron horse, or otherwise known as the steam locomotive. The beginning rise of the railroad would soon open up new opportunities of transport that would become far superior than the slow and maintenance-heavy canal systems that popped up in the early 1800s. Despite its downfall, the American canals were pivotal in the rise of industrialism and trade in the early days of the United States, connecting the lives of people in the interior with the lives of the people on the East Coast. It was one of these canal systems that would spark the curiosity of an unnamed man in 1859 who, traveling and out of work, found income on board a canal boat. At this time, the United States was suffering an economic depression, and many were seeking employment, including our unnamed man, who I will humbly call John. Now, John was from New England and seems well educated to us who try to glimpse into the past. He seems to also have an interest in the science of nature and insects. He was a naturalist by hobby, if not at one time by trade. The economic downturn caused John to travel around to find work where he could, and his wanderings brought him to the industrialized town of Cumberland, Maryland, where John had friends. It was in this town that the man enjoyed the beauty of western Maryland by exploring the tributaries of the Potomac River and the steep rocky cliffs of the Narrows. It was his friends who suggested that he join a canal boat crew, as that crew navigated the canal from Cumberland with a load of coal to Georgetown, just outside of the nation's capital of Washington. This 184.5-mile journey would take him along one of the great canals of its day, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Now, John found employment on board the Caroline of Williamsport, captained by a brother-in-law of one of his friends, a man only referred to as Captain Coss. And so, our journey begins. Before the C&O Canal and other canal systems, the interior of America was relatively isolated from the coast. Farmers and other suppliers of goods could not bring their product to market to the coast, and so they relied strictly on selling locally, which was not very profitable. Other solutions were created, such as shipping whiskey instead of grains to the east on wagon roads, but this was still dangerous, slow, and even a cause of war. The Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania was directly caused by farmers unable to move their grain to market in the east. Then the Potomac Company was created. The Potomac Company created a water transport system on the Potomac River by creating downstream V's and even a system of locks at Great Falls to allow long, narrow transport boats called bateaux to traverse the natural waterway that divided Maryland and Virginia, called the Potomac River. The Potomac Company, relying on a natural waterway, was prone to delays and safety issues as rising and falling waters, flooding, and seasonal changes affected the route. Relying on nature was extremely unpredictable, and something better had to be In In early March of 1825, one of the last acts of his presidency, President James Monroe signed a bill chartering the construction of the C&O Canal to provide a more reliable source of transport between the western interior and the east coast of the growing new nation of the United States of America. Groundbreaking for the Grand Ole Ditch was held July 4th, 1828, where President John Quincy Adams took a spade and shoved it into the ground, hit a root, had to take off his jacket in order to try to get a shovel full of dirt. He eventually succeeded, but it was a precursor to show how difficult that the C&O Canal was going to be in carving through the mountainous regions that it was supposed to traverse. As the mass construction project began and progressed, the canal opened in sections as the rest of the 184.5-mile length was being carved from the banks of the Potomac River and blasted from the Appalachian Mountains. The first navigable section of the canal opened in November of 1830, with operations in the Georgetown area opening in 1831. Construction was difficult as the construction crews faced sinkholes and caverns in Shepherdstown, diseases sweeping through the workforce, which was made up of indentured laborers, and ethnic violence and hatred as Irish and German immigrants competed and fought each other. Despite the slow progress, the Grand Ole Ditch made it to Dam Number 6, just west of Hancock, Maryland, in 1839. It was the last 50 miles of the canal that proved the most difficult and the most expensive. After carving its way through the mountains around Old Town, Maryland, and snaking on its way to meet up with canal infrastructure built around Cumberland, Maryland, it became required to dig a tunnel through the mountains to allow the canal boats to pass through the mountainous region. The Paw Paw Tunnel was 3,118 foot long, took 14 years to complete, and cost $616,478.65 to build. This would be about $26 million in today's money here in 2025. This was the last obstacle that the C&O Canal had to overcome to finally connect Cumberland, Maryland to Georgetown near Washington, D.C. The canal opened trade between the two locations on October 10th, 1850, taking around 22 years to complete, and in doing so became a marvel of American engineering and ingenuity. Though the canal's long journey to completion allowed for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to reach Cumberland before it, which occurred in 1842, between the marvel of the canal and the technological advances of the railroad, the canal was actually more efficient. It was cheaper to ship goods via the canal than the railroad, even though it was the slower choice. The canal would take an average of 7 days to travel, where the iron horses of the B&O Railroad could do it faster, but at a very higher cost. It wasn't until the 1870s when advanced technologies and more powerful locomotives and braking systems allowed for the railroad to slash their prices and overcome the cost differences from the canal. John, our naturalist vagabond, arrived on the docks of the canal at Cumberland. Many boats were docked there that late June day. The canal boats before him were all similar in design, long and slender with raised sections on either end, raised 3 feet above the deck that acted like cabins. The back end was divided into a stateroom with berth for the crew to sleep and a cooking galley. The front one was the barn that stored hay and a place for the mules' teams to rest. The boat's hold in the center was concealed within its belly, where many were stored with coal from the mines of western Pennsylvania and Virginia. Coal that was desperately needed by the steamer ships that now occupied the coast of the United States of America. Behind the berthing quarters was the tiller deck, where the ship was steered, and below it was a cockpit. Painted with white and green, the boat that John approached seemed to be well taken care of. Now a young boy was tending to the mules that stood just off the docks near the boats. John always liked animals, so he approached a team of 2 with curious eyes. As he got close, he heard a shrill young voice shout out, "Take care there! Them mules will kick a chaw of tobacco out of a man's mouth 3 rods off." John quickly backed away as the young boy looked at him gruffly past his wide-brimmed straw hat for trying to approach his mule team. Backing up to the boat, 2 men leaped from the deck and onto the towpath. One man was an average-sized white man, a little rough around the edges, of course. The other was a tall, strong African-American man. Now, the white man approached John. "Are you John, my new yeoman?" "Yes," replied our naturalist. "Well, welcome to the ship." Before our naturalist was Captain Koss and his first mate, Henry Picayune Butler. John was introduced to the crew. First was Captain Koss. Though not his real name, Koss is the name that has lived on in history. Previously, he was a sailor on warships in the salty seas, but settled here on the C&O Canal. He was a canaler captain who made his living here on the interior waters. He owned 2 boats and had a family and house here in Williamsport, Maryland, at mile marker 100 along the C&O Canal. The bowsman, or first mate, was a free black man who went by the name Pick, a shortened version of his nickname Picayune, which he may have picked up from a black musician at the time called John Picayune Butler. Our naturalist, in his writing, said it came from a congressman called Henry Butler that shared the nickname. Either being the case, Pick bared his nickname with pride. Pick was not the most well-educated man, which was a hard reality for African Americans at that time, and also a fair amount of poor whites as well. However, Pick always had a big vocabulary tucked away in the back of his head that he enjoyed showing off when the occasion called for it, though he often did not use the words as they were originally intended, or he often mispronounced them. Despite this, Pick was more than willing to share his lexicon. The rest of the crew consisted of a young African-American boy who was Pick's son. John realized this fast when he was introduced as Little Pick. The 12-year-old Little Pick was a jack of all trades aboard the canal boat, but mainly led the mule teams. The last of the crew, John had already met. The young white boy, Tommy, with his straw hat and rough demeanor, greeted our naturalist earlier when he went up to pet the mules. Tommy, who was also 12 years old, led the mule teams. He was recruited by Captain Koss along the canal, and he was paid for his expertise as a teamster. Finally, the mules themselves were the last and one of the most important parts of the crew. There were 4 mules. A team of 2 would pull the boat with a long rope along the towpath to propel the boat forward, while the other team of 2 rested and fed in the barn aboard the ship. Once the operating team got tired, the second team would be unloaded and hitched to the rope to continue their voyage. The C&O Canal was constructed along the natural waterway of the Potomac River to have a continuous water supply. It was a long ditch that crossed the countryside of Maryland with the use of locks to climb the hills and mountains, culverts and aqueducts to go over natural waterways, and dams to feed water to the canal and allow river navigation in areas that a ditch could not be dug. Another innovation was one tunnel that allowed for the canal to travel under a mountain, and this is the famous Paw Paw Tunnel that we already kind of discussed. So on the C&O Canal, you had a towpath, which is actually right across the canal ditch from where I am standing at. It's a walkway over there. The towpath was a raised path that usually set between the canal ditch, which was divided into levels, and the Potomac River, which the Potomac River would be on the other side over there. It allowed for the travel of the mule teams and the teamsters that propelled the canal boats and towed the boats, hence why it's called a towpath. The towpath today is now the biking and hiking trail for the C&O Canal National Historic Park. The canal levels was the actual ditch, which is right here where I'm standing, that was filled with water, and they made up the canal system. Each level was maintained at a certain elevation and were separated by lift locks that allowed boats to rise or fall to the next level of the canal. And if you look in the very far distance there, you will see a canal lift lock separating this level from the next level downstream. Now the levels allowed for a slow, controlled current of water within the canal and allowed the boats to travel long spans across the countryside. A canal lift lock is designed to allow for a boat to travel on water over terrain such as mountains and hills. It allows for a boat to lift from one level to another, or lower from one level to another. On the C&O Canal, each lock is numbered, with lock number 1 being in Georgetown and lock 74 located near Cumberland, Maryland, making the total number of lift locks being 74. A lock works by water flow and water pressure. If a boat needs to be raised, it enters the lock on the lower end of the lock from the lower level, which is where we're at right now in correspondence to this lock, and the lower doors are then closed. Flaps on the upper doors are opened and water pours into the lift lock where the canal boat sits. Over time, water fills up the lock, putting pressure on the lower door and raises the canal boat to the height of the water on the higher level. The pressure releases on the upper door, which are then opened, and the boat can be navigated to the upper level. For a boat needing to be lowered, it enters the lock and the upper doors are closed. The flaps on the lower door are opened, letting water out of the lock and into the lower level, putting pressure from the upper level on the upper door, taking away pressure on the lower door, emptying the lock and lowering the boat. The lower doors then can be opened and the boat can then move onto the lower level. Lift locks were typically made from cut stone, like this one behind me. The lock was narrow to accommodate just enough room for a canal boat. It was important for the rudderman to control the boat when entering these locks. A misstep could result in damage to the boat or to the lock, which none of those were desirable. Also, most locks had a bypass flume next to it, which you can see on the side of this lock, and that was to allow water to go around it when the lock was closed. Also to note, lift locks would also have lock keepers who usually lived near the lock and operated it. That was part of their job. They were given a house, which is like one right here, and that's where them and their family would usually stay, so they could be on duty and open and close the locks as needed for canal boats to pass. The C&O Canal has over 200 culverts along its route. A culvert allows for the canal ditch to travel over a small natural flowing waterway that the builders did not want to incorporate into the flow of the canal's waters. Typically, a culvert on a canal was made of stone. They are usually arched stone tunnels built over the route of the flowing waterway and then buried with dirt to allow the ditch to be built over top of the built tunnel. A traditional aqueduct is a man-made bridge to transport a body of water over some sort of span, and a lot of times another body of water. This is the same concept for an aqueduct here along the C&O Canal. For natural flowing waterways that were too wide to be traversed by the use of a culvert, an aqueduct was constructed to allow canal boats to cross those bodies of water. There are 11 aqueducts on the C&O Canal, the longest being over the Monocacy River, which has 7 arches. This one here over the Conocajig has 3. They are typically named after the river that they navigate across. This is the Conocajig Aqueduct over the Conocajig Creek. These were also usually constructed from cut stone, much like a stone arch bridge for road crossings, and contained a walkway for the towpath. Also, usually a nice fence to keep the mules from falling off the side into the creeks or the rivers. And of course, they have the narrow canal ditch running there as well, full of water. There are 7 dams associated with the C&O Canal on the Potomac River. These dams could have several functions. They could be used to build up water to facilitate canal boat travel to the other side of the river to Virginia or West Virginia. They could be used to facilitate canal boat travel on the river itself to get around natural cliffs that prevented a canal ditch to be dug, which is one of the functions of dam number 4 that's behind me here. And it also, these dams could be used to provide a water source that could be used to fill and provide that source of water for the canal ditch itself, which is another function of dam number 4. These dammed up areas behind the dams on the Potomac rivers were known as slack waters. Now the area here behind dam number 4 is known as big slack water. Dams were usually associated with guard locks or river locks, such as the one behind me here. This is guard lock number 4, which is associated with dam number 4. Now, river locks or guard locks worked very similar to the lift locks on the canal system. But these kind of locks actually allowed for water and boats to travel outside of the canal level network and onto the waters of the Potomac River. Despite the feat of engineering that the canal was and the importance it served in American transportation and trade, the C&O Canal began to wane in relevance in the late 1800s. With the advancements made in railroad technologies, constant flooding issues causing damage to canal infrastructure, and the rising cost of maintenance, the C&O Canal became less profitable as the 20th century arrived. After the devastation of mass flooding in the 1920s, the canal was closed in 1924, unable to compete in the age of the iron horse and unable to maintain its infrastructure. In 1938, the federal government purchased the C&O Canal to turn it into a recreation area by employing people through the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, to employ Americans during the Great Depression. But this work was halted in 1941 with America's involvement in World War II. Congress then expressed interest in creating a parkway, but with flooding being a constant issue, this was also reconsidered, though openly pursued. Many fought the idea of turning the canal into a parkway, including U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice William O. Douglas. In March 1954, Douglas led a hike from Cumberland to D.C. along the Towpath in support of maintaining, preserving, and protecting the canal. With this newfound support, the federal government had the entire towpath cleared of debris and brush for hiking purposes, and by 1960, bicyclists were traversing the entire towpath for recreation. In 1961, President Eisenhower made the canal a national monument, and then in 1971, President Nixon signed into law the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historic Park Act, making the canal a National Historic Park. In 2022, the canal welcomed over 4 million visitors, making it the most visited National Historical Park in the United States. So that is your introduction to the C&O Canal. I only covered the highlights of this beautiful park and only scratched the surface of its wonder. You see, the C&O Canal is very special to me. As a boy, my dad and I and my friends and family have biked and hiked the towpath and kayaked and canoed next to it in the Potomac River, a tradition that I continue with to this day. The canal is where I learned adventure, flora and fauna, conservation, architecture, and of course, history, as I biked its towpath, scurried down the trails to the river, explored cave and culverts, climbed tunnel portals, and looked down on the limestone walls of locks and aqueducts. I would recommend any part of the 184.5 miles of the canal to any family who wants to bring their children to a place of fun and learning, and because of that recommendation, I hope to bring you on some of my adventures here on the canal as I explore some of the locations in depth. So come aboard, blow your horn, and enter the realm of the canal boatman as we ride on their towpath, and maybe we will see each other on the towpath someday.